Hey guys, it's Ostrowski here from the Teach Better team, and I am thrilled to be back. We had an amazing session yesterday with Blair Edeker, and we designed a grid from start to finish. So now that you know how a grid's made, today we are going to dive into managing what you've created. So I'll be back in just a second so we can dive in. Hello and welcome back to our grid method series. I hope everyone's having an amazing break, whether you're joining us live or on the replay. Today, we are going to be diving into managing your grid, managing the classroom around mastery learning and the grid itself. And this is a huge topic. We already have some people excited in the comments, which I absolutely love to see. So this is going to be a little bit of a mixed session. I have some things I'm going to cover, but if you have questions, if you want to know a certain thing, don't be afraid to comment and let me know what your questions are, and I'm happy to articulate or answer those questions in any way, shape, or form. So I just want to get started talking about some general 1,000-foot view tips and tricks on managing the grid. This is a huge topic of conversation. A lot of times when I walk a teacher through creating the grid, they go, cool, I got it. I just need to know, what does this look like? And how do I manage all the kids being in different places? And how do I deal with student motivation? Or how do I know where my kids are or what they need? Or how do I get the kids to work? Or what do I do with that kid that's not working at all? All of these are perfectly relevant questions. And as teachers, a lot of times we need to see the whole picture before we're willing to dip our toe in the water. And that is perfectly fine. And today I'm hoping to give you some more of that picture and help you feel confident and comfortable starting this process in your classroom. Or if you're already using the grid, or you've already started, or maybe you're about to start the grid, hopefully giving you some tips and tricks to overcome some of the barriers so you don't have to work through them by yourself. Good morning, Nikki. I hope you're having a fantastic day. So first and foremost, I want to talk about some of the basics of management, okay? One of the biggest things that teachers feel when they start the grid method, based on my experience, is that they need to change everything. But I want to be very clear. If we go back to the roots of really good classroom management, all of these things are still going to be in place. If we think about Management 101, it's about systems, routines, expectations, and yes, of course, relationships. We want to focus on student-centered management, regardless of if you're doing the grid or not. And we need to put systems in place that support the expectations we have for students. One of the important reasons for this is that we cannot expect the grid to manage students for us. To be honest, this is a grid. It is a piece of paper with squares on it. Now, we walked through how this gets created yesterday, but it's simply just a piece of paper. It's a learning progression. It's not going to manage your classroom for you. You have to put the systems and procedures in place, and you have to build the trust in the ownership in the relationships between you and your learners so that this can thrive. Planning and making your grid is only the first step. Executing and managing the systems and routines that build the community in your classroom, the trust between you and your students, and the ownership they can have over their learning is absolutely critical. So I want you to not overwhelm yourself with all the things you have to change. What I want you to focus on first is keeping what works. You may already have a ton of really good systems and routines in your class, and those might not have to change at all. You might have routines on how students get supplies. You might have routines on how students ask questions. You might have routines on how students collaborate and work together and do things. Just because you're doing the grid method or just because you're changing to mastery or self-paced learning doesn't mean you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Doesn't mean you have to throw anything away. You can keep a lot of what's already working in your classroom. And I want to be super clear about this. One of the things that I say in our workshops all the time is that I have been to hundreds, and our trainers have been to thousands of grid method classrooms. We have seen every single grade level in every single educational or economic setting you can possibly imagine the grid method work. And one thing I can tell you is that I or my trainers have never been into two classrooms that look identical. We've never been to two classrooms that are even the same. Even if you walk across the second grade hallway in an elementary school that's running the grid method, the teacher on one side of the hallway might be doing a beautiful job running the grid, and the teacher on the other side is also doing a beautiful job. But their classrooms feel, look, and are very different. Nothing I'm going to say today or ever say is something you have to do. I'm merely trying to provide templates, resources, tools, and tips to make this experience better for you. One of the first things that often happen when we start to talk about grid is teachers start to worry about pace. They go, oh my gosh, how do I deal with all of these kids in different places? It's going to be crazy. So keeping pace is a huge focus of a lot of the questions I initially get when teachers start with this. One of the things we show in our trainings and our workshops is that you should map out your grid and how long you think it's going to take from start to finish before you start your grid. You shouldn't just go, hey guys, start your grid and we'll see how it goes. I've had teachers try this, and what ends up occurring is students just kind of keep working on the first grid as long as you let them, with no deadlines or suggested flexible due dates. Students don't have any motivation to continue working. I hope there's some intrinsic motivation there, but most students haven't built that yet, especially at the primary, middle levels, or of course at the high school levels. So setting out a calendar and saying, when are we starting the grid? When do we intend to finish the grid? Okay. And having that in place so that you can allow students to be aware of where they are, if they're ahead or behind on that pacing guide, can be really, really helpful. Now, if you remember from yesterday's session or you know anything, we know that the minimum goal is to get to the level of the standard. That's the minimum goal you have for everyone. So when you're setting out your pacing calendar, you want to use that minimum goal as the end mark. If students can work beyond that, great. But you don't want to make working to level 5 on your grid, if your standard's at level 3, the goal. You want to make level 3 or the end of level 3, if your standard's at level 3, the end goal for everyone in your class. This will keep the pacing more realistic. Something that tends to occur is teachers will put the whole grid in their calendar, and then they wonder why the grid's dragging on. Well, students do not need to go beyond the standard. It's really, really helpful if they can and if they're able. And of course, you want to encourage this, but we need everyone to get at least to the standard. So if we map out a reasonable calendar that meets the need of the standard, we can then truly allow the kids that are able to enrich themselves beyond that standard. But if they can't, it's okay. Not every student needs to finish every box on the grid. I want to be very, very clear about this, but it should be expected that every student meets the level of the standard or the highest standard that is being covered in the unit. So I hope that helps with some of the pacing stuff. And when we talk about pacing, I also want to talk about monitoring. Now, in terms of monitoring your classroom, I feel that you cannot manage anything you are not monitoring. So this could go anything from borrowing pencils to actual monitoring the pace of your students. So let's talk about logistics real quick. Something I did in my own classroom that I highly recommend is that I numbered every single desk in my room. And anytime I gave supplies out to students, the numbers on that supplies would match the numbers at their desks. This created what I call management through accountability. When students know they're held accountable, they are far less likely to try to push the boundaries of any expectations you have for them. Notice I didn't say rules, I said expectations. Expectations are critical for management to be successful. But if we just place teacher-centered rules on our classroom, you're going to get pushback. You have to set high expectations. So one of the things I highly recommend is monitoring anything that you intend to manage. Of course, you can monitor supplies and how kids do things, but more importantly than anything else, if you are implementing the grid, you need to monitor where kids are on the grid. If you are not doing this, you are setting yourself up to fail. You are literally setting yourself up to not be able to manage your classroom. If you don't know where students are on the grid, you are not going to be able to support them in their needs. You're not going to be able to know what they're on, what they're supposed to be doing versus what they're not supposed to be doing. In fact, you can even monitor what they're supposed to be using. Something I used to do is I would say 1A or 1B on the grid requires a computer and headphones, which meant it was noted on the progress monitor that I was using in my classroom that you could just look at that really quick and say, I need a headphones and a computer. But also I could look at it from a teaching perspective and go, you're not on 1B. Why do you have headphones in right now? So it made management really, really easy because I was combining the systems in the routines. I hope that makes sense, but we need to monitor and know where our students are. Do not expect that your students will just kind of monitor themselves, or that at the end of every day, you'll kind of check in to see where your students are at by looking at all of their grids and the last thing you signed off on. You have to have a progress monitoring system in place. That is absolutely critical. The next thing I want to talk about is that engagement is management, okay? And in fact, engaging students is perhaps one of the best ways to manage them. Engaged students do not misbehave very often. Engaged students are actively learning. We need to make sure that students are active in the process of learning. One of the things that tends to happen is when we design our grids, we tend to fill them up with things like worksheets and reading because those are really easy go-to student self-paced things. I'm not saying you can't put worksheets on your grid. I'm not saying you can't put reading on your grid. I'm not saying you can't put videos on your grid. You should probably and do probably use all of those things. But if I look at a grid and I'm worksheeting a kid to death from box 1 to box 14, chances are they're going to disengage from that grid and I'm going to have behavior issues in my classroom. So it's really, really important. It's really, really important that we are setting ourselves up for success. If we don't think it's engaging, evaluate your grid for the level of engagement you're providing. Are there hands-on activities? Are you mixing modalities? One of the easiest things to do is, let's say you have 3 worksheets in a row on your grid. If you take one of those worksheets, okay, and turn them into a hands-on activity or a card sort, you have now entered a different modality into the equation. So the engagement level is going to go up. The other thing is that when we are looking at engagement, we have to look at mixing the timing of each of the assignments. For example, if I'm a learner and I know that every box on the grid takes 45 minutes, I am not going to be willing to start a new box if I have 10 minutes left because I know it's going to take 45 minutes. So even varying the time of the boxes on your grid can be a super useful tool, where if I have a 5-minute box next to a 30-minute box, next to a 50-minute box, next to a 10-minute box, kids are going to be more motivated because of the random assortment of how long each of the things take. For example, if you put shorter assignments, they're going to stay more motivated too because they're going to feel that progress. But if I have 2-hour boxes on my grid, every single box, the motivation is going to start to go down. So I really, really want to focus on engagement as a management tool. If students are not active in the process of learning, they are going to be active in things they're not supposed to be active in. We need to keep them focused and engaged, okay? This also brings me to learner motivation. So we all, when we're thinking about self-paced learning, when we're thinking about mastery learning, the number one question I get is, what about the kid that's not doing anything? My first response when this question gets asked is pretty simple. I usually inquire, Is that kid not working because of the new environment, or were they not working and they're continuing that behavior? For example, if I have a student that's never done any work and then I have them start on the grid and they're continuing to do no work, that is an existing behavior that continued. It's not a new behavior because of the new framework or the instruction being used. So the question I genuinely ask is, what do you normally do? So that's the number one thing I ask teachers when they ask about managing the grid. They go, what do I do if that kid's not working? What do I do if that kid's on playing games on his Chrome browser? What do I do if that kid's not off task or talking to his friend? My first question, and the first question I want you to ask yourself is, what do I do normally? How do I normally motivate? How do I normally correct? That probably still applies. Going back to my first point of Management 101, we need to be able to keep learners motivated. Now, motivation falls into several categories, right? Maybe there's an academic motivation. They want to improve academically, but there's a lack of motivation due to socio-emotional issues or trauma, or maybe they're just having a bad day. Motivation can come from a lot of different reasons. We need to be aware of these reasons, and we need to address the specific need that the student is giving us. When a student's demotivated, we need to ask ourselves a few questions. A, is this a normal behavior for the student, or is this a new behavior? Are they normally motivated, but they're not? Then we can identify, maybe I have to have a conversation. Maybe I have to dig a little bit deeper. If it's a normal behavior, we need to address the cause of the behavior. Are they not being, is it not differentiated enough for them? Are they struggling? Are they having other issues outside the classroom? These are all questions you can ask. Now, there's also those kids where you check in, you identify their need, you've addressed their need, you've asked them a question, and they're still not working. That's actually when I would use something called a refusal to work slip. So one of the biggest things with management for me is increasing ownership of choices, decisions, and actions on the part of the student. Oftentimes as teachers, we take ownership of everything the students do, and then we absolve them of any ownership. This is quicker and easier a lot of the times, but it can be detrimental to the success of the student because now they're learning that you're going to stress more about their behavior than they are. So one of the things I would do is if I've checked in with a student, I've had a conversation, I'd get something out called a refuse to work slip. This is just a quarter sheet of paper, and it simply had a very simple message on it. It said, I, student name, there was a blank slot for it, am refusing to work towards my learning goals today. I acknowledge that my teacher has tried to help me multiple times and that I'm failing or refusing to work towards my potential today in this class. I also acknowledge that this will negatively impact my performance and learning in this environment. You can change the wording however you want, but this little slip of paper was crazy effective. It was one of those things where the students would go, wait a minute, why do I have to sign this? Well, I'm actually trying to help you and support you, but you've said you don't have any questions. You've identified that I've done everything I can do. So at this point, you're just making a decision. So I've done everything I can do. So I need you to own that decision. And I would either have them sign the slip. And if they refuse to sign the slip, I would say refuse to sign. And then that could become a pass to maybe a counselor or some other aspect of that I can get the student what they need. When I got to that point in the management process, that was usually an indication that I had done everything I could do from the classroom perspective to support that learner. So I would either need to bring someone to the classroom so I could dive a little deeper with that student, maybe like a checkout protocol, or I would send that student where they could get additional help from either a counselor or address some of their needs. So I'm not saying this is a perfect system, but this is a really useful way to increase the ownership, right? And this actually comes from another indicator that things are wrong in the learning environment when we use fear to dictate behavior. So a lot of times we will try to use fear and kind of dictate students' behavior, but we need to remove that fear and increase ownership and trust with our students. So we need to remove the fear. One of the biggest things students are afraid of is failing. Whether they let you know or not, how many of you have had the situation where a student says, I'm not going to do this, it's too much work, or I'm not even going to start or pick up my pencil because I think I'm going to fail this thing. They might not say that out loud, but that's a lot of times what's actually happening in their heads. If students are afraid to fail, they're also going to be less motivated to start in the first place. But if we remove the fear of failure, FAIL, F-A-I-L, stands for first attempt in learning. We want to embrace failure. We want to embrace struggle because that's where learning and that magic happens of cognitive growth. If students are never struggling, they're probably never learning. I want students to show me what they don't know so that I can help intervene and support their work. So we need to create environments where assessment isn't a bad word, where assessment is an opportunity to prove that they know or don't know something. And if they don't know, it's okay. It's not the end of the world because there's another attempt behind. Yes, I am talking about retakes right now, okay? We need to allow students to assess for mastery in multiple ways, and this will help remove the fear of failure. Now, some of you were thinking, hey, if I just let kids have retakes, maybe they're going to not try as hard the first time. Well, this actually has not been the case in my experience if it's done correctly. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If you just give a student a Google sheet and say retake it 50 times if you don't get it the first time, they're going to not try. They're going to just retake that Google form. But if I make failure harder than success, I can actually create a retake system. I can actually create a retake framework and put a system in place so that there's an agreement between me and the student. For example, if they fail an attempt to demonstrate mastery or readiness to move on, they need to do something between attempt 1 and attempt 2 before they get that attempt or they get access to that attempt. Because of this, now if they aren't demonstrating mastery initially, it's more work for them to get to attempt number 2. This will organically motivate them to try really hard on attempt 1 because now the easiest path to success is being successful the first time, which could mean studying a little bit more. It could mean trying a little bit harder, or it could mean waiting a little bit to take that assessment until they actually feel like they're ready. But if you don't have a retake policy in place, that can be really detrimental. There needs to be some intervention or learning between attempt 1 and attempt 2 whenever we're talking about retakes. Some people are also saying, Chad, retakes don't happen in the real world. Well, first of all, you're wrong. Second of all, they happen all the time. Driver's licenses, SATs, ACTs, the GRE, the praxis for teaching and other subjects, the MCAT, the LSAT, you name the major assessment, driver's tests, whatever, they allow retakes. Master's programs, thesis dissertations, they all allow resubmission, correction of work. So why are we arguing about third grade spelling tests? I don't know either. We should be removing fear and making learning safe for every single student. When we dictate that if you fail, you can't learn anymore, or we give this grade on top and say you're never learning fractions in fourth grade math, we're hurting the process of learning. We're showing them that if you fail, it's over. The process is done. We need to make failure an inherent part of learning to remove the fear of that failure. We need to get students comfortable with struggling and overcoming that failure. And teachers who implement the grid method tell me all the time that students are willing to try harder on the grid than they ever have been before because they've removed that fear. Now, this also comes with increasing ownership and trust. We need to be building positive relationships with our students. When a student comes in late, you don't want to say, why are you late? Say, I'm so glad you're here. That's a really easy shift any teacher can make that can save a relationship between you and the students. When we become adversarial with students, we become the enemy. There's no way around that. And if you're the enemy, you're not going to be able to get trust and gain that respect for students. So if you're building the proper environment, you're removing that fear, management becomes second nature because they're going to trust and inherently believe you're going to do what you say you're going to do. So the next thing I want to talk about is probably one of the most common things I tend to see get missed when teachers start implementing the grid method. And I'm going to bring this back up here. This is a grid, but this is seriously just boxes on paper. This is a progression. The magic of implementing and executing the grid happens around those boxes. When a student doesn't demonstrate mastery, what intervention is going to be happening? What are you doing to help that student? Are you embedding collaboration? Are you allowing students to work together? Intervention in meeting students' needs is the number one way to reduce management issues. When students' needs are met, they are less likely to act out. They are less likely to fight back because their needs are being met. They're comfortable. This is common in any literature about childhood psychology, from an infant all the way up through adolescence and high school age students. When needs are met, security is achieved and learning can happen, right? Oftentimes we hear things like Maslow before Bloom's. I actually disagree with that statement. I think it should be Maslow and Bloom's. I don't think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can create a safe Maslow-focused environment while learning and Bloom's and DOK are happening, okay? It doesn't need to be, I only focus on Maslow's and SEL in these practices, and then I can do learning. It's, I need to create an environment where those needs are taken care of and security is provided, so that way we can learn at the same time. So that's just a perfect example of it doesn't have to be this, then that. I think I just saw a question come through. I'd love to see it back on the screen in terms of taking time. How do we find time to implement the retake protocol when your units or quarters have a hard deadline? So, Rebecca, thank you so much for that question. In terms of retakes, just because you have a hard deadline doesn't mean you have to be done measuring that goal, that objective, or that standard. You can give students a first attempt at the deadline and then continue to measure that same standard with additional assessments as you continue progressing through the unit. So I want to be super clear. Students are allowed to not demonstrate mastery, and you are allowed to document that lack of mastery. It's perfectly okay. If you need to end and move on to the next unit, Rebecca, and your district says you have to give an assessment on this day, that can still be a first attempt. You can still allow them to reassess. So internally, you have the data that you grew them from where they ended up when that unit was over. This is especially pertinent if you have spiraling standards. If I'm an ELA teacher, Rebecca, I think you're an ELA teacher. If I'm getting that wrong, let me know. But if you're an ELA teacher and you're spiraling something like citing textual evidence, you might assess that in quarter one, but they might not master it till quarter three. So you might reassess that later and go, okay, cool. You didn't know that when you got assessed at the end of unit one, but you do know that at the end of unit 4. So Rebecca, let me know if that makes sense. But remember, just because your district's dictating when you have to give an assessment doesn't mean it has to be the final assessment you give on that standard or that topic. I also recommend, and we do a ton of work on this, tiering your assessments. So instead of saying this is one task, one assessment, and here's your grade, know which questions are assessing which target or which objective. Make a section of the test for each of the targets from your grid or each of the standards that you're covering in a unit. Then you can measure each of them individually. So a single assessment can then have multiple grades attached to it. So a student might only need to retake section 3 of an assessment, but be okay on the other sections. But if we haven't done the data dive to know which questions are assessing which standard or objective, we can't do that. And they just get what grade they get. Once again, this is also going to help you have a better relationship with students because you can go to that student and go, wow, you got 3 out of the 4 sections spot on this assessment, but we still have some work to do on citing textual evidence. So we're going to keep working, and I'll give you some opportunities in the future to continue to learn that. So I hope that was helpful. I think that is a reasonable request, but you actually bring up a really great point here, Rebecca, in that you need to manage things in a way that is manageable for you. So if things become too complicated with classroom management, you will stop doing that. We will only continue to monitor and manage the systems and routines that are easy to manage and monitor. So Rebecca actually brings up a great point. If you have a retake policy that's super stressful for you, you're going to eventually break that system down and it's going to stop working. So when we think about managing and putting systems and routines in place, we need to think simple and easy. If we can have students take on responsibility, that's always going to be helpful. If we can have student volunteers take on responsibilities, that's always going to be helpful. If we can put systems in place that reduce our stress as teachers, things are going to be easier to manage. A lot of times this happens at the beginning of a school year when we go, I'm going to do the grid and I'm going to do these 57 systems. I'm so glad, Rebecca. That's awesome. So we have like 60 systems. We're like, I'm going to put all these great things in place. How they sharpen pencils, how they go to the bathroom, how they do X, Y, and Z. And we feel really, really good. And then by like week 3 of the school year, 50% of those systems are gone. And then by week 7 or 8 of the school year, 70 or 80% of those systems are gone. And we're left with the shell of what we thought our classroom was going to look and feel like. Well, a lot of times it's because we're overthinking. We're putting too much on ourselves so that we are overstressing the systems that we have to manage. When we do that, the systems will break down. The systems will break down. So I want to be super clear about that. So in terms of general management on the grid method, I am absolutely cool if anyone wants to bring up specific needs or questions they might have, or maybe questions that you're struggling with right now. Now is the perfect time to bring those things up. I love hearing myself talk, as my team knows, so I can talk all day. But I want to give everyone the opportunity to, if you want to chime in, if you have questions, now is a really, really good time. Another really common thing that causes management issues in grid method classrooms is like kids lining up at the desk, right? Like teachers cannot get through checking off students. Teachers can't get through doing all the quote unquote grading or assessing that is happening continuously throughout the class period. So one of the things we often suggest on the team is batching your checkoffs. For example, just because a student is done with a box on the grid does not mean you have to check it right then and there. They can continue working for the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes on the next box before you are able to get to them. We do not want to set up situations where students are idle or they're just waiting around. That's going to increase your management issues. So one of the things that I highly recommend is set up an expectation or a system so that when students are done with a box on the grid, they can signal you. We talk about the triage system, whether it's a color-coded system or cups, or the tracking sheet changes the color, whatever you want it to be. There's a system where the student identifies or lets you know that they're ready to get signed off or checked in. And then you can set the expectation of what is the learner supposed to do while they're waiting. Some teachers don't want them to move on, so they'll say you can do X, Y, or Z. Other teachers will just simply say, continue working on the next box of the grid until I come to you. And then when you go to that student, they might be done with 2 boxes instead of 1. Simply assess both of those learning tasks and the outcomes of those boxes and checks for readiness. And then you can say, cool, you can move on to the next box, or you can get back. So Bree has an awesome question. Have you had grids that are interdisciplinary for self-contained classrooms for literacy and science? And the answer to that is absolutely. The grid actually works really, really great for PBL. Actually, we've combined it a ton with our proprietary Teach Further model, where we bring in community connections into the classroom in sort of a PBL-focused way, so that you can absolutely merge and do hybrid grids, and many teachers absolutely do that. To Bree's question, it's also a really great way to maintain engagement, right? So if you're bringing in those real-world connections, doing projects in bigger units, that's a really, really great way, especially in a self-contained classroom. Additionally, you can also make a grid between 2 non-self-contained classrooms. We've actually had like social studies and science teachers, or ELA and social studies teachers, or math and science teachers create collaborative grids that students work through when they switch classes. You progress monitor the students or create a block schedule so that they continue working. We've even seen an entire grade level working on a single grid, where they got rid of the entire bell schedule and had groups working through projects from room to room. So they stopped following their daily schedules and started working through a PBL. And in 3 days, they did amazing work through the grids themselves. So there's a ton of options that once you anchor your planning into a mastery-based progression, become available to you. So Beth, I absolutely love this question. So Beth is asking about a science class and whole group stuff. And Beth, correct me if I'm wrong. Please feel free to kind of chime in here. I'm assuming you mean like experiments, demonstrations, or maybe big class excursions outside where they're collecting observations and data, stuff like that, right? So one of the things I'm going to show you guys that a lot of teachers don't think is possible, I need everyone to watch really closely. This is super complex. It might be confusing. Is everyone ready? So you have your grid. You just put it down on the desk and say, hey, guys, we're not going to do the grid today because we're going outside to look at leaves. I'm going to show you that again. That was really, really complex. So in case anyone missed it, hey, guys, we're not doing grid today. We're going to go outside and look at leaves or whatever the activity is. You can always kind of press pause on the grid and do that thing. What I don't want you to do is random acts of stuff, though. Don't randomly go, we're going to go outside and look at leaves, and then we're going to come back and talk about something you have no idea about. The same thing goes with experiments. If I have to run a really messy experiment, okay, if I have to run a really messy experiment, I am not setting that thing up 15 times. If I have to run a demonstration where I set something on fire, I'm not doing that 46 times. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. So with that in mind, I'm glad you enjoyed that, Beth. With that in mind, you can say, hey, everybody, there's an experiment on 2B on the grid. So if there's an experiment on 2B of the grid, everybody by Wednesday, September 14th, everyone might not be on 2B on the grid. But on September 14th, we're all going to do this experiment. So here's where it gets like kind of tricky depending on the thing. But let's use a science experiment as an example. If I'm running an experiment, I can actually have students run the experiment, hypothesize the outcome, collect the data, and we can even have a class discussion. But what I really care about is what conclusions are they drawing and what analysis are they doing with what they observed. Like those are where the scientific thinking around experimentation actually happens. So something you can do is cut the scientific method kind of off where the thinking starts and the execution stops. So what you can do is you can say, everyone's going to run this experiment on Wednesday, whatever day that is. We're going to have a discussion. We're going to run the experiment. We're going to set up the demonstration. We're going to collect our data, and then I'm going to press pause. Maybe we have a discussion. Maybe I just have them take some notes at the end of it. And then when they get to that box on the grid, they can graph their data. They can analyze their data. They can draw their conclusions, and they can explain the phenomenon that they observed. That's how I'm assessing the mastery. So that's the part that they need to do or should be doing either independently or maybe with a partner or in conjunction with a conversation that the class already had. So you can do the same thing with a play that you're doing or a mock trial or anything like that. The student experiencing something is not them mastering something. This is a really weird concept for a lot of people, but I want to be very clear. Just because you do something in your class does not mean you've assessed their understanding of what they observed. So if you can save that assessment piece or that reflective piece, put that on the grid, but have them all take that experience in stride. So you can say, we're all going to have this experience. I want you to take notes, collect data, make observations. And then when we get to the date you're supposed to be on this, you're going to reflect and give me your analysis of what you observed. So let me know if that was helpful. I think that's a pretty simple solution, but I want to be super clear. Like I've never told a teacher they cannot do something on the grid because it's on the grid. Unless you come to me and you say, hey, I really want to lecture 50 minutes a day and give tests on Friday. Can I do that in the grid? Not really recommended. But I've never said, no, you can't do this because you're doing the grid. I've had teachers do Socratic seminars, PBLs, experiments, field trips, all sorts of different things while running the grid. So if you have specific questions about any of those things, we can absolutely talk more about that. So that was a great question. I absolutely want to give you permission. And that also brings me to the idea that a lot of times teachers will go, hey, am I allowed to quote unquote teach in the grid? First of all, don't say it like that because you're always teaching. All right. If you're running this properly, you're teaching all the time. You're having one-on-one conversations, small group conversations, intervention sessions. You're always teaching. So don't say that I only teach when I'm in front of my class. That is a misnomer. That is false. Okay. What the actual question becomes is, when can I lecture? When can I do notes? That's the act or the instructional strategy that you want to ask me about when you say, when do I teach? And you can absolutely cover material while you're doing the grid. Most teachers actually take 10 to 15 minutes every single day and do mini lessons. Now, based on the research, after about 15 minutes, that's kind of the limit for retention. So something else needs to happen after 15 minutes, or you're going to start losing the kiddos and you're going to start losing retention, and you're basically going to start wasting a lot of time. So 10 to 15 minutes of a mini lesson on a daily basis is absolutely okay. Some teachers go, I have a lot to cover. Can I do direct instruction or whole group stuff on Monday? Absolutely. And then go back to your grid Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then some teachers go, hey, Friday is going to be a review day or a whole class day again. There's a ton of flexibility here. So I don't want you to think that just because you're doing the grid, you can't do other things. I want to give you full permission to do that. But here's the caveat. I'm going to put you, if you're taking notes right now, put a big asterisk here. The time you take away from students from progressing on the grid is time they will still need to finish the grid. So what I don't want you to do is go, we're going to do all this whole group stuff and then wonder why your kids are not progressing on the grid fast enough. I hope that makes sense to everybody, because you can't take away time for them to progress individually on their pathways for mastery and then go, hey, why aren't you guys progressing when we lectured 4 days last week? So just be aware of that balance. There's a time and a place for all of these things to happen, and they all can happen. But if you overuse any of them, you end up kind of hurting the progress of your students. Now, as I'm sitting here thinking, I'm also trying to remember what are the most common things teachers ask me during training, or what are the common things myself or our trainers on the Teach Better team see when we go into schools. And there are a lot of things, and we've covered most of them. One of the other really common things I get is, what do I do about the kid that is not progressing? What do I do about the kid that is not doing anything on their grid and they're stuck on level 1 and everyone else is on level 3? We already talked about motivation, so I hope you kind of took notes back then and you have those ideas of what do I need to assess and address in terms of motivating students. However, I want to ask you a very simple question, because if you say that it's week 3 of the grid and a kid's still on level 1, I need to know what has been done since week 1 to help that student continue to progress. We cannot just let students drown or wither away on level 1. What interventions are we doing? Pulling small group, creating learning teams, increasing collaboration. These are all options to help the success of learners in the classroom. So I want you to ask yourself, if a student is behind, what have you done and what can you do to support their learning? And this doesn't always have to fall on you. If you have two students that are behind, maybe create a learning team. You could also create some peer-to-peer tutoring scenarios because you know where your students are. Do you have a classroom aid where you can kind of get them some one-on-one time, or can you pull some one-on-one time that is protected? Small group workshop model, all of those work amazingly well in the grid. I've seen some amazing teachers that actually spend most of their day with a small group. They circulate the room and then they pull the next small group. If you are pulling small groups, you can also protect that time. For example, you can have a no sign-off policy for the first 10 minutes or the last 10 minutes of the class. This will give you more time to address student needs, and you can say, sorry, if you need signed off, Continue working, and I will get to you tomorrow. This will free you up to do those housekeeping things, maybe pull a small group without having 14 kids line up at your desk. So all of these are things that teachers can do to help support processes for students to get intervention, get support, and get help. So I'm going to give some awkward wait time to see if there are any additional questions as we are starting to kind of come to the end of our session today. I'm going to open this up a little bit and see if there are anything that you guys will need. Rebecca coming in strong. I absolutely love it. So two of the important things is that it's okay to modify the teaching strategy. I love that, to fit you and your students. Absolutely, Rebecca. No two classrooms are the same. And just because you don't do it exactly how I said it doesn't mean you're not doing it correctly. So Rebecca, like, that's my favorite comment of all time. And I love that you said it that way. In terms of adjusting this to meet your needs, there are no real limitations as long as you're maintaining the basic pillars of mastery. If you're going to tell me that you're going to kind of start knocking down those philosophical pillars of mastery, or students can never retake assessments, like, you're going to have some issues. But Rebecca makes a really, really great point. There is no aspect of the grid method that will hurt your students or your instruction. It is all based on best practices, research-based strategies. So whether you're just using the grid for planning and that's all you do, your instruction is going to improve. If you're just going to start progress monitoring, your instruction is going to improve. So to Rebecca's point, there's no part about this that's going to hurt your instruction. Janelle had a great question where she said, how many checkpoints would you say we should have? The more touch points you have for students, the better off you're going to be. But I want to be very clear. That you don't have to make that stressful for you. You can do student self-checks. You can do short checks. You can do peer-to-peer checks. You can do submissions on like a Google self-graded form. So in terms of checkpoints, there should be some sort of accountability for readiness at the end of every box. But the depth of that accountability or the depth of that checkpoint doesn't have to stress you out every time. We talked about this a little bit when we were designing our grid yesterday, and there are a variety of different assessments you can use. You can embed assessments. You can do quick exit slip checks. You can do teacher conferencing. You can do all of these things. The minimum I would suggest, honestly, is the end of each level, there needs to be some sort of check to make sure the students are ready to continue learning. That's the minimum. But you can do smaller checkpoints through the progression or through the levels that will help support the idea or the progression that the student is working on. So, Janelle, let me know if that answers your question or if I can expand on that at all. But in terms of how many, as many as are manageable for you. But when I say that, also be evaluating and reflecting on how simple are you making the checkpoints for you to manage. So we don't really want to over emphasize, like, I need to meet with a student one-on-one every single time. But definitely build in those checks. One of the things, Janelle, I'm so glad that was helpful. One of the things, Janelle, that I want you to also focus on is if you overuse a certain type of checkpoint, the negatives about that checkpoint will get bigger. So if you only do self-graded, you're going to get more gaps in learning that you aren't aware of. But if you only do teacher conferencing, you're going to get so bogged down with conferencing, you're not going to be able to manage your classroom. So when you look at your grid, look at those checkpoints and go, am I too involved throughout the grid? Are only my students involved throughout the grid? You want to kind of have a mix for all of those things. So Kylie also has a great point. She says that it's important to note that you have to have the philosophy of first attempt in learning, or FAIL. We need to be okay with failing. And Kylie, I'm actually in love that you brought this up, because as we're trying systems and routines out, and I think this is actually a great note to kind of close things out on, not everything is going to be perfect the first time. You are going to struggle through. You're going to create ideas and management strategies that don't work. You being transparent about that's going to build trust with you and your students. Like, when something's blowing up in your face, and the students know that too. You trying to hide it benefits no one, and it just benefits your ego as a teacher. But if you say, hey, I messed up, guys, this isn't working, I'm thinking maybe we try something else. What would you think about this? And getting student input. I love that take, Kylie. The idea that we as educators have to embrace failure and be transparent about the struggles that we're having is super, super beneficial. And as Rebecca just reminded us, we have to make sure that the things we are putting in place are manageable for us. No matter what I told you today in the last 50 minutes or so, if it's not going to work for you, don't do it. Like, I don't know how else to overly simplify this. We have to make this work for you. I'm not in your class. I'm not necessarily in your school every single day. I may not have ever been in your school. Some of you, I have been in your schools. But I'm not going to be there to say, this is right, this is wrong. We need to be okay with going, that doesn't work for me, but this other idea I have does work for me. And as long as it's working for you and your students, it's probably okay. There's no such thing as the grid police. People think that the Teach Better team busts through the wall and goes, hey, you're doing something wrong on the grid method. That's never happened. It's not like the Kool-Aid Man situation or anything like that. We are not going to break down your door and tell you you're doing something wrong. Make it work for you. So I absolutely hope this was a helpful session in that we were able to address some of your needs in terms of managing the grid. I want to thank everyone for participating and giving up some of their valuable holiday break to participate, ask questions, and interact. Thank you guys so much for the trust that you put in the team and everything you do in the classroom every single day. I hope that some of these management tips were great. And we are going to be back tomorrow talking about how should we manage the grid method from a building leadership perspective. So what can administrators do? What can principals do? What can central office do? What can all of this leadership do to make sure that as you're starting this journey, those things are going to be going smoothly? And what should they absolutely not do that might hurt the progress at a building or district level? So if you're trying this and you want your administrator to join that conversation, please feel free to shoot them a ping or a text. And we will see you guys tomorrow. Until then, stay awesome. We'll see you back at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Have a fantastic